When you look at the regulatory reports from the Charity Commission, invariably all of them finish with a single paragraph that says, and if only there had been a speak-up culture within the organisation, this could have been so different.
Fraser, thank you very much for coming in to speak to us today about making Speak Up human. And before we get into things, if you could just tell us a little bit about you and your role, just to sort of give context to this.
Will do, and thanks for having me. My name's Fraser. I am a lawyer by background, and I work heading up the ethics, governance, compliance function at the Wellcome Trust, which is a large philanthropic foundation based in London, but funding globally. And we fund science to achieve global health outcomes. Part of my role within our ethics, governance and compliance function is making sure that we build a culture where people feel safe and confident to speak up. And we've taken that as a deliberately strategic approach to make sure that we build the sort of culture that we want, but also importantly that we're able to respond to issues at the earliest opportunity to try to improve the organisation for all of us.
Oh, fantastic. And Speak Up is not necessarily something that's new. It's been a part of corporate life for a while, but there does seem to be a renewed interest and vigour around Speak Up and Speak Up culture for various factors. I'm sure that we'll talk about them later on. But if we could start maybe by just setting the scene a little bit in terms of just giving a little bit of insight into when we're talking about Speak Up culture, what do we really mean by that?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a term that a lot of people interpret in different ways. And the way that we have taken this really is an extension and a humanising of the concept of whistleblowing, albeit that it can be extended further into a really positive outcome of encouraging people to not only raise issues but also celebrate successes. In our context, though, we really look at it in terms of raising concerns of wrongdoing, by which we mean breaches of law and breaches of policy. And for us, what we want to do is create that psychological safety and that confidence that if people have concerns, that they have a number of avenues through which they can raise them.
And there is also, is there another side to Speak Up culture as well, which is, one of them is what you spoke about there, the reporting of wrongdoing, the raising of issues that need addressed. But then the other side is that improving the well-being and belonging that people have within their organisation, that psychological safety of which Speak Up is an incredibly important component.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a number of drivers. And when it comes to perhaps understanding why an organisation might want to pursue a Speak Up culture, I wonder whether it's worth thinking at different levels. There's maybe why might a board be interested in it, why might management be interested in it, and why might staff be interested in it. And I'd propose perhaps from a board level there might be a strong enthusiasm around crisis prevention. How can we hear about things before they become so toxic that there's a crisis? And that's a really valid reason. At a management level, well, perhaps the same, but also how can we reduce the number of problem incidents? How can we limit the management time that takes, the cost of that? But from a staff perspective, I think it's really important from a culture, a belonging, a trust perspective. And that's really both for current and future staff. And I think there's a really strong outcome of having a Speak Up culture that works, that really drives forward a positive organisation.
Yeah. And I suppose the other side of that coin is, what is the consequences of kind of getting it wrong or taking an excessively sort of policy-led approach and forgetting the human side of things?
Yeah, and getting it wrong, I guess most severely, is thinking that you don't need to worry about it. The ostrich approach, I don't want to hear about bad stuff happening because that's going to cause me problems. Well, what goes wrong there is that you end up with crises, you end up with a disengaged workforce, and all sorts of problems. And I think that's why we're seeing a number of the regulated industries taking such a focused line on building appropriate cultures. I think if you get it wrong by taking a policy-led approach, I think that's good. I think having a policy and infrastructure around it is necessary, but it's insufficient to create the change. So I think taking that approach is better than doing nothing, but you probably end up with a situation where your Speak Up program isn't going to be as effective as it might be. For me, creating a Speak Up culture it's a people-focused thing. It's about trust. It's rather akin to baking a cake. You know, you need a recipe, yes, a bit of tech, you know, food mixer, that really helps. But actually there's a whole bundle of ingredients there, and, you know, missing one out is the difference between something really tasty and something that's inedible.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's not as simple as just here's a policy, here's a bit of training done.
Yeah.
I think it takes time, it takes commitment, and it takes really overt commitment. It isn't just about saying to people, you know, I'll hear you. It's about making time for them to feel heard.
Yeah.
And that's really hard. I'm not going to pretend at Wellcome we get that right all the time, and I don't think anyone does. I think probably if you feel that you get it right all the time, you're deluded. But it's something that you need to keep working at consistently.
Yeah, and a couple of things on that commitment point. How important is it to get that buy-in at the top, to get the signalling from the top of the organisation that this is something that we value and is incredibly important, and not just, you know, something that's mentioned, you know, in passing and then forgotten about, but really followed through with?
I think it's absolutely critical, because I think not doing it makes something tokenistic. And I think what's absolutely critical isn't just having the tone from the top once; it's the consistency and the repetition of the message. Without that, you know, I think things fall flat, and that's really common, and everybody will struggle with that. But I think it goes beyond just tone from the top. And that's really something we looked at with our communicating around this to the organisation, which is to say, who are the genuine influencers in the organisation? Yes, people listen to the chair, the chief exec, the chief operating officer. Of course, huge amounts of tone from the top, huge importance, people do listen. But there are plenty of other people that carry significant, if not much more influence in the organisation. Who is it that people actually listen to, trust? Is that somebody who's been in the organisation for 30 years? Is that, you know, somebody who talks to everybody every day, whether they're the front desk staff or working in the canteen? You know, there are real influencers there, and I think it's important to work out who those are and to try and leverage that, because that sort of trust is invaluable.
In your experience, Fraser, what are some of the barriers to people speaking up and coming forward?
Well, I think there are a number, and this really stems from Speak Up being a hard thing to do. There's emotion, and we need to recognise that it is challenging for people. And so the provision of support really helps get over that barrier, and the provision of a menu of options around how you help people to speak up is important. But I think some of the other identified barriers that some of the research has shown is around a perception of futility. So if people feel that I'm going to speak up, but no one's actually going to listen up or act up, you know, and that onus is on leaders. You know, people that run speak up programs, we can create all the mechanisms and do all of the outreach we like, but if a leader isn't actually going to demonstrably listen and do so consistently and act on it, then you can see that a sense of futility would...
One thing to speak up, but then there's the other side to be heard as well, to make sure that
Precisely.
Heard,
Precisely. And I think another really important piece to pull out is the fear of retaliation. A lot of people do sort of say, well, yeah, but I could raise my concern, but if I do, someone will turn against me, or I'll be sidelined when it comes to promotion. And so I think it's really important that people think about how they would manage that, to be really clear to staff that retaliation piece and victimisation, it will not be tolerated, and that you're actively looking for signs of it. And I think that's really important. It's really hard to do, but it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we go on to talk about sort of the wider strategy behind Speak Up, and then some of the practical components of it, do you get the sense that there is a renewed vigour and interest in Speak Up, driven by various things? I mean, at CEDR, what we're hearing from clients is there are increasing sort of clashes between employees and between employees and employers over, you know, things like sort of values and ethics and policy, you know, and it can range from very deeply held personal views on, say, geopolitical crises, right through to, you know, your individual circumstances around, say, home working. And that's not even talking about the sort of reporting of wrongdoing and illegality in some instances. So do you get the sense that there is a real appetite for talking about this and doing something about it at the moment?
I think there absolutely is. I think all of those pieces you've mentioned around geopolitical issues, I think it's a sort of loosely used term around sort of Gen Z, but I think we're seeing for the first time, somebody told me the other week, we've got for the first time 5 generations in the workforce, with relatively few Gen Z at the board level, so a real disconnect potentially. So I think there are some real cultural shifts, coupled with the proximity of the outside world, and coupled with the need for people to find trust somewhere, perhaps in an environment where our trusted institutions are falling down around us. So I really see that. But I also see it from a regulatory perspective. Now, I work in the charity sector, so I have a particular proximity to that. But we've seen it with, for example, the Financial Conduct Authority bringing out strong rules around conduct and providing speak-up mechanisms within their handbook. But within the charity sector, we've seen crisis is a strong word, but some of them have been crises, after crisis after crisis. And when you look at the regulatory reports from the Charity Commission, invariably all of them finish with a single paragraph that says, and if only there had been a speak-up culture within the organisation, this could have been so different. And those issues have related within the charity sector to culture, to safeguarding, for example. But we see the same in all sectors. And I think if you sort of regard yourself as somehow immune, again, you're deluded. We see issues arising within schools, within the church, within politics, within sport, particularly where there is a strong power imbalance between leaders and staff. There will be issues in your organisation. And if you're not actively searching those out, those will become a problem for you. And if you see your peers having issues that come out as toxic crises, and your instant reaction is to say, thank goodness that wasn't us, rather than, oh my goodness, we're next, I think you're going to have problems.
So does it take a certain bravery to sort of start from the perspective of, or the starting point of, look, there is definitely going to be issues, we need to be proactive in how we deal with them?
I think that's right, and I think it's recognising that any organisation is actually at its root a group of people, a group of human beings who are fallible, who have emotions, who find things difficult, who do things wrong. And in any group of people, no matter how worthy you are, no matter what you're doing, stuff will go wrong. And that's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it's okay as long as you recognise it and try to proactively do the right thing off the back of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big part of why companies have been encouraging employees to speak up for so long is to drive that well-being, engagement and innovation, because only by bringing forward things that are going wrong or bringing forward the best ideas can you ultimately make progress. So there is a great opportunity, I think, for organisations. It's not just about dealing with the stuff that's going wrong, but really leveraging the talent that you have within your organisation.
I think that's absolutely right. And so there's a real strong link there through to sort of employee voice architecture. How is it that you engage with your staff? And I think that's something we're really seeing from Gen Z entering the workplace. People are really wanting a connection. And as an employer, if you're not giving that, I really think that is going to prove to be a problem. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And if we can now go on to talk a little bit about sort of where Speak Up sits into sort of the wider strategy of organisations, because one thing that we see, and some with initiatives around Speak Up and psychological safety, is organisations sometimes take a sort of patchwork approach, or we'll develop a policy here and that's enough, or we'll do a bit of difficult conversations training here and then just leave it there. I mean, how critical is it to think about Speak Up, psychological safety, all these things as part of a wider strategy, not just as a small component that we can just deal with, leave, move on to the next thing?
Well, I think that's right, and I think any bolt-on will be seen and will function as something ancillary and not be effective. I think this really needs to be sort of key, central to your overall people strategy. I would say this, wouldn't I? I do business integrity. I think it's absolutely core to a business integrity strategy. I think what you need to do is to recognise, particularly when it comes to identifying wrongdoing, that your people give you hundreds, thousands of pairs of eyes and ears, and if they trust you and talk to you about what they perceive as going wrong, then that's really helpful. You know, yes, auditors are great. They're going to come and tell you what went wrong last year. Yeah. Wouldn't it be so much better to know that something's about to go wrong so that you can try and tackle it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's incredibly valuable. So I think it's central to that business integrity approach, and I personally believe that should be central to every organisation.
Yeah, and you're obviously in the legal side of the function as counsel, and you know, to what extent do you work closely, say, with the sort of people functions in the organisation, HR, ER, business partners, and like that, to sort of bring these policies to life?
We absolutely do. So work very closely with our colleagues in the learning and development team, because a huge piece of bringing this to life goes far, far beyond creating a policy. It's around learning, it's around training, it's around bringing things alive. But we also work very closely on the sort of pure HR side, because actually so much of what is spoken up about when you get into its detail is at its heart a grievance. And so very much it's around being able to involve our colleagues in the HR function at the right time to be able to handle those things through the grievance processes. And that's one of the big challenges, is really sort of making that interface as smooth as possible for people that are raising concerns.
Yeah, and I think that's quite a nice segue to sort of start talking about, okay, so how do we make this a reality on the ground? What are the sort of practical components that you've seen that can really make a difference? And you know, we might start with grievances or investigations, but I think it'd be good just if you could give us some sort of overall thoughts around when it comes to speak up culture, what can people do or start thinking about straight away to make a difference?
It's a great question, and I think focusing on practical things is so important, because otherwise this becomes a bit ethereal. For me, the starting premise is always the policy environment being essential but insufficient. So it's what are the practical steps that you can do to bring that alive. So it's making sure that that you focus on having an engaging learning and communications program, and that you do that in a repeated cycle so that the message hits home. I think that's absolutely critical. I think also making sure that Speak Up is part of that broader integrity strategy. You can create a Speak Up program that's massively successful, and you get people raising concerns about all sorts of things. Yeah. What you really need to do is also be making sure that your environment reduces the number of concerns people have. Yeah. So make sure that your overarching policy environment is helpful, it's accessible, people can understand it and use it, that your policies aren't just gaining virtual dust in the online filing cabinet. Yeah. We tried to do things like adding a too long don't read section. We recognise in human behaviours that no one is going to sit down and read all of our policies from cover to cover every day.
So your phone provider provides an update to the T's and C's. Does everyone, sit and read through them all? Yeah.
Exactly. So let's recognise that human behaviour, and we pull out a box at the top that effectively says, we know you're only going to read 6 things, so here they are. Yeah. Focus on learning and not just training. Mm-hmm. If you put a training video in front of people, great, it's better than nothing. Yeah. But actually, how can you go beyond that and reinforce things? We're starting to look at, and we'll be launching shortly, ethical dilemmas. Mm-hmm. So getting people to do rather than just watch. Yeah. And I think that's really, really powerful sort of thing. I think another sort of takeaway is to think strongly about how you communicate within the organisation. This is very far from legal, but I think this is really so important. And that's thinking about critically the language you use, but also the sorts of branding that you use. How can you get hooked into people's minds? So we've tried using specific imagery that people identify with Speak Up. But I think also that language, if you frame your Speak Up programme around whistleblowing and the Public Interest Disclosure Act, PIDA, that's terrifying to a human being. I mean, I'm a lawyer and I get scared by it, and I'm supposed to find that stuff normal. That's why I think sort of more human language around speaking up is helpful. I was talking the other week to a friend who's a chief integrity officer on a language mission in his organisation. The example he gave is slightly different to Speak Up, but he was struggling to get his colleagues to focus on the importance of doing due diligence on external organisations, and they didn't care sounded too complicated, it was scary. When he changed the tone to getting insights on other organisations, everybody suddenly was all over it because that's what the organisation cared about.
Reframing.
And I think reframing into language that resonates with your organisation is really, really important. What you've got to have is something that feels normal to people.
Yeah, and one thing we've spoken about before is the avenues in which people come to speak up to you, and trying to make them as human and as accessible as possible. Have you got any insights into how, or any thinking around how you can do that to sort of make it less intimidating for people?
Well, I think when it comes to speaking up in this sort of utopian world, wouldn't it be lovely if every concern you could just raise with your line manager and it was resolved over a cup of coffee in 5 minutes? That's never going to happen. Often your concerns will be about your line manager, so you might feel that you can't raise it with them, or it would be career limiting, and that's problematic. So I think providing sort of what we describe as a menu of options is quite helpful. Effectively recognising that everybody will feel comfortable and uncomfortable in different ways. So provide people with different avenues. So within our organisation, we have an external advice line that people can speak to on a confidential and legally privileged basis to understand the impact on them and on others of what speaking up might result in. We offer the ability, obviously, to speak to line managers, wouldn't that be nice? But to come and talk to the ethics team as well, face to face, and that's great. But we also recognise that people might value the ability to raise concerns anonymously. And so we provide an external reporting tool through an app that allows people to raise their concerns anonymously. And that can bring with it some other challenges. But I think by providing that set, you're giving people choice. And when you give people choice, they feel in control. And in a stressful situation, having a bit of control is good. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And one thing I'd like to pick up, she mentioned earlier, was around the managers, because they are a critical part of this, because they're the ones who are working with the team day in, day out. They're often the ones who are providing the interface or mediating perhaps between employees and the leadership and company policy and higher up. How critical is it for them to have the confidence and skills to be able to engage with these incredibly challenging issues? Because what we find is often, managers are required to do this, and there's a lot of research. And Gartner put up some recently around 57% of managers are responsible for handling the conflicts of the direct reports. But that doesn't always go hand in hand with the practical skills needed to be able to engage with really challenging issues, whether that's having a difficult conversation, giving feedback, informally mediating between two colleagues who are not disagreeing. So if you've got the avenues right, but if the people who have to actualise that aren't able to, it kind of falls down. So how critical is that for you?
I think it is critical, and I think it's really hard, not least because managers change and teams change, and it's difficult. So I think some upskilling there is really important. I think it's also really important not to put that all on managers. I think it's around making sure that managers have the right signposts of where to go and are empowered to listen and to be able to support, but that other mechanisms are there. I think also, though, there's stuff we can do to help empower the organisations generally. One of the things we've found helpful, we trialled it within our legal team and we've recently done it across the organisation, is to undertake active bystander training, which is designed to give individuals a very simple toolkit to use in the moment on how to challenge or deal with difficult behaviour in the moment. And I think that's really helpful because it doesn't put the onus on a manager to be the person that's come to solve the issue. It empowers everybody within a team to support each other. And I think those sorts of initiatives can be really helpful in legitimising what you're trying to do, but also in supporting both those who are feeling challenged and also managers in dealing with it.
Yeah, no, I suppose another part as well is HR, ER, and obviously grievances and investigations are they're here to stay and they're a critical part. But again, it's making sure that they have the skills and the confidence to be able to manage that process well, because often, triggering a formal investigation or grievance can sometimes get people's backs up and reinforce perceptions of power imbalance and the organisation versus me and so on and so forth. So it's important as well that they're able to have those really difficult conversations.
I think that's right, and I think I was talking about the scariness of language. Raising a grievance, that's something scary that you sort of hope you're never going to have to do or be part of. And it is a scary process, and I think one of my perceptions is that very often it takes a lot before someone gets the activation energy to raise a grievance, and quite often the feeling within many organisations is that if I raise a grievance, I've almost got to accept that the outcome is that I'm going to leave the organisation, and of course that isn't a constructive outcome for anybody. And so I think it's really important that from an HR perspective, we see the grievance process as being something that is a constructive resolution process, where the resolution is a positive win-win outcome, for the person accused of wrongdoing, the person raising the concern, and the organisation and everybody else in it. That's what we're striving for. And I think mediation, for example, has a strong role to play in that. The informal mechanisms. I worry sometimes that in some organisations, once somebody says they want to raise a grievance, it's straight into a very formal process. And as you rightly identified, very often those processes build in a lot of challenges. If the grievance is being heard by more senior people within the organisation, very often at a more senior level there's less diversity, and that can be a real challenge. There are obvious power imbalances. There can sometimes be a feel of politics. Those are all difficult, and those are all things that I think we really need to be conscious of, and really try to make sure that we get constructive processes, and that we this is a really hard thing to do, but that we talk about that, and that we show them to be fair and clear. It's one thing for them to actually be fair and clear, but your staff need to feel that they are. They can be as fair as they like, but if people don't feel that, then keep trying.
Looping back to the importance of leadership and sort of the top of the organisation being very proactive about this. You've been involved in this for a while and have been at the heart of developing these sort of policies and cultures. What sort of questions, should leaders be asking themselves when they are, say, thinking about implementing a speak up culture, or maybe they have done and it's not gone as well, or they're looking to improve? What are sort of the things that they should be sort of reflecting on as part of any initiative to improve on this?
Absolutely. I think there's probably about sort of 5 questions that I would pose. First one, really, how do your people in your organisation know that you care about speaking up, and really importantly, that you're going to listen up and act up and do something with what they talk about? Secondly, what is it that you're doing to help your people understand your code of conduct or policies in the context of their day-to-day work? Thirdly, how are you addressing behaviours that aren't consistent with your code of conduct or policies? And include in that your own behaviours, because this only works where everybody's being held to the same standards. Fourthly, how do you know that your people are hearing a clear and consistent tone in relation to what's expected of them, and how they can speak up where they've got concerns of wrongdoing? And then I think finally the really important one, and this is challenging for all leaders, is how is it that you hold yourself accountable? Because if you don't, your current staff and your future staff will. So I think that's a really important one to get to grips with.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and it's been a fantastic discussion today, and your knowledge and passion and enthusiasm for this topic has really come through. And thank you so much for giving up your time. And do you have any sort of final thoughts on what we've talked about today? I mean, one of the things that really came through for me was, organisations are not going to get this right all the time, and that's fine. But what is really important is, are they doing the best that they can in order to try and achieve positive and better outcomes from speak up and the raising of wrongdoing?
I think that's a really good one to pull out. I think humility is central to it. It's recognising that we're just people at the end of the day. Things will go wrong, and that's fine. It's how we handle that matters. And proactively making the space, making the time to listen to your people is so important, and it's important from a risk perspective, it's important from a culture perspective, and it's really important for an achieving your purpose perspective. And I can only see it getting more and more important as the context we operate in keeps developing.
Perfect. Fraser, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.